Hello, I'm John and thanks for watching this Mobile Mirage tutorial. Today we're going to cover the very basics of After Effects. We'll learn how to create a composition, import objects, and manipulate the properties of those objects, as well as discuss the keys for understanding those properties. Let's get started. When you first open After Effects, depending on the version you are using, there might be a start window in the middle of the screen. And in the middle of that window, under Name, it will display the most recent files you've opened. If you click on them, you can open them from there. If this is your first time opening the program, it should be empty. However, if you look on the left, you'll see New Project and Open Project. Let's click on New Project to get started. You'll notice that there doesn't seem to be any space to work in right away. We'll need to create one in order to animate anything. At the top, you'll find a menu called Composition. Open it and click New Composition. A composition is your workspace, and its settings determine everything about it. Next, you'll notice there are some presets for our composition. When you open that menu, you are greeted with a lot of options, and it can be difficult to know which one to use. The first choices are Web Video and Web Banner. Their purpose is obvious, but even then, they aren't necessarily always right for it. Then there are NTSC and PAL settings. These are two standards intended for analog television. As such, they are for the most part out of date. Then there are the HD settings, or high definition. These are intended for more modern televisions and computers and other devices. And finally, there are the film settings. These create large files and are intended to handle footage from cameras used on feature films. Let's choose HD TV 1080 29.97. After the preset is selected, you can still customize the composition properties. The width and the height of the composition is measured in pixels, and it will determine the resolution of your comp. The pixel aspect ratio is how the composition interprets the width of individual pixels. For most modern devices, this is a square pixel, or a ratio of 1. The other ratios listed are mostly for analog TV. The most common reason to use anything other than a square pixel would be for specific widescreen formatting on television. Next, we can choose the frame rate. 29.97 is still the industry standard in a lot of companies. The decimal number was originally developed to compensate for black and white television when color information was introduced to the carrier wave. With the then standard of 30 frames per second, the color information caused visible disturbances on black and white TV sets, but at 29.97 frames per second it didn't. This fraction of a frame is called a drop frame, and despite black and white TV sets' long absence, it is still commonly used. Most of the other frame rates were decided based on the current of electricity running through analog TVs, which refreshed itself 60 times every second. This meant that unless the video had some fraction of 60 frames per second, it experienced a wave-like distortion. Most modern devices compensate for this, but it is still a good animation standard. Generally speaking, the higher the frame rate, the smoother the animation, but this also results in longer render times and larger file sizes. Between 24 and 60 frames per second is the ideal range. Now for the timecode. Don't let the word code scare you. You aren't going to be doing any programming here. The start timecode is where your measure of time begins in the composition. It is measured by hours, minutes, seconds, and finally frames. I usually keep it at all zeros, but there are specific cases where you might want to change it. The duration is how long your composition is, and it is measured the same way. So if you want a 1.5 second composition, you would type in 1:15, keeping in mind that our frame rate is 29.97, and 15 is roughly half of that. Finally, the background color. The composition's background is technically the color alpha, which is just another way of saying it's transparent. But depending on your render settings, this will determine the actual color that is rendered, if nothing is placed over it. With all your settings set the way you want, press OK, and you now have an area to work. In the next video, we will move on to more exciting stuff, like importing and animating objects.